They laughed and raised their crystal glasses under the chandelier, while the smell of roast quail slid from the kitchen like a prayer. No one at the head table saw the cook's hands, scarred, steady, pause for half a breath over a copper pot. No one heard her whisper, "Let the night remember." If stories like this grip you, tap subscribe and like so more people see them. Now watch closely. The house was a river of white silk and loud money. Magnolia branches scraped the balcony rails, their blossoms fat and fragrant as cream. On the lawn, a brass band tuned up, the horn testing a golden note that floated to the moon and back. Inside, lace veils brushed stair banisters polished by generations of boots. The bride's laughter chimed in the hall, nervous, sweet, wrapped in pearls. In the kitchen at the far end of the corridor, the fire glowed low and sure, and heat shimmered above iron and copper like the air over a road in midsummer. She stood at the center of that heat. Folks called her auntie in public and nothing at all in private. On the ledger she was property, assigned to kitchen labor, age unsure. Her true name lived in her chest where no whip could reach it. The scar across her forearm had a neat edge, like a line a ruler might draw. She wore a plain blue dress faded to the color of rain and a head wrap that kept the sweat from her eyes. Knives lay in a row, gleaming. Chickens hissed in lard. Sugar turned to amber glass in a narrow pan. A two-handled mortar waited, seeds tucked beneath a folded rag like a sleeping rumor. "Faster!" snapped the mistress as she swept through, skirts swishing like brooms. "The judge wants his turtle soup hot." Auntie bowed with her eyes only, ladled a taste to her lips, and nodded to no one. The mistress vanished, trailing perfume and impatience. Every dish had a story. Oysters in cream for the groom's father, who measured a man by the shine of his boots and the weight of his pocket watch. Buttered carrots for the bride, who once chased fireflies barefoot before her mother taught her the correct way to walk. Hummingbird cake tall as a Bible for the auntie with sharp opinions and softer teeth. And turtle soup for the judge, who grinned when he passed sentences and called it wisdom. Steam kissed auntie's face. She moved the way a skilled prayer moves, quiet, precise, certain. In the recess by the woodbox, a boy of 10 fanned the fire with a strip of cardboard, his bare feet black with soot. He had her eyes and his father's silence. "Water," she said, and he passed the dipper. "Wood," she said, and he fed the stove. "Listen," she said, and the boy held still. From the ballroom came the clack of shoes on parquet and the clatter of toasts. "To the house," a voice cried. "To the old names," cried another. Fiddles woke and a caller sang steps over the shine of the floor. Down the line, "Turn your lady, bow to the gent, smile for God." Laughter swelled and broke like surf. Somewhere upstairs, a cousin vomited delicate champagne into a linen towel and begged for more. Auntie lifted the mortar's rag. What lived inside had no smell that a happy man could name. Crushed seeds the color of old bronze, a pinch finer than sand. She had learned its measure the way a body learns a hymn, half a knuckle for a cup, 2 knuckles for a pot. Safe tucked into starched napkins when patrols searched the quarters. Safe traded by mothers who knew the cost of births with no midwife and nights with no law. Safe as a secret can be when the world wants it dead. On some years she had used it to ease fever. On others to hush a pain no doctor would touch. Tonight it would do what no whip could, choose the hour. In the alley beyond the scullery door, summer gnats spun like smoke. A mule stomped. Whispered voices drifted. Field hands sneaking a minute for breath. Someone hummed low. Auntie set her jaw and tasted the soup again. Pepper, sherry, patience. She let herself count, slow, even, like she had counted under lashes, like she had counted her children born and gone. 1 for Ruth. 2 for Simeon. 3 for the little one who never learned to reach. For all the names they tried to grind down to Auntie. "Plates," she said. The girl by the rack jumped and hurried. "Wipe the rims. No drips." Auntie moved the mortar nearer, as natural as reaching for salt. The boy watched without blinking. "Mama," he said, quiet. "Keep the fire," she answered, just as quiet. The ladle trembled once in her hand and then steadied. She tipped the measure that looks like nothing into the soup that smelled like home, and the surface took it all with no change at all. In the hall, the bride paused at the dining room door while the groom kissed her knuckles as if he'd invented tenderness. "It's perfect," she whispered, and the groom, who could afford mistakes, smiled like the world was a porch built for him. Portraits of men with heavy noses and heavy rings looked down from gold frames. Another toast popped, cork skittered like a beetle across the floor. The judge shook his watch once and declared dinner. The serving line moved like a wagon train in a storm, steady, burdened, inevitable. Dishes marched past Auntie's station, spoon bread like clouds, greens slick with fat, quail crisp as paper, turtle's broth dark as walnut stain. She poured and wiped and nodded, and every nod pushed the night forward. The mistress hovered at her elbow. "Mind the judge's bowl," she hissed. "He's a friend to this house." Auntie did mind it. She filled it just so. She set it at the front of the silver tray. Her eyes did not flinch. From the corner of the kitchen a clock clicked. Click, click. Closer now to the moment when words become acts and acts become the only truth that matters. She felt the boy's breath at her side. "When?" he whispered into the blue fold of her sleeve. "When they stopped talking long enough to listen," she said. She sent the tray away. Heat pressed on her shoulders like hands. Sweat gathered at her temples. She wiped her palms on her apron, folded, unfolded, smoothed a wrinkle that wasn't there. She took down the sheet pan with the little pies, pecan, hand-sized. The nuts were glossy, sunk in a syrup as dark and deep as a well, and the crusts had the swift, sure crimps of a woman who had needed to be fast since the day she learned to walk. She laid the pies in 2 neat rows. 2 got something extra under the syrup, a thread no I could catch. 2, and only 2. Nothing here was sloppy. Somewhere a champagne cork popped wrong and took a sconce with it. Guests laughed and clapped as if disaster were a parlor trick. The band slid into a waltz, fiddles sweet as cane. She could see a slice of the dining room through the swinging door, the bride's shoulders bare and straight, the groom's hand light at the small of her back, a set of old men trading stories that always ended with one of them on a horse. The judge lifted his spoon, steam curling like a blessing. He blew across the surface and smiled at the cook he had never once called by a name. She sent the pies. Her hands, freed, found the counter's edge and held it. Inside her, a small door opened onto a field at dusk, cicadas loud, a child asleep across her lap, the smell of damp cotton and wood smoke. Freedom had always smelled like that to her, like evening and mud and a long road. She did not close the door. In the scullery the girl rinsed a pan and whispered, "Miss," then bit her tongue on the rest. Auntie took the pan, set it aside, and lifted the pot of coffee from the back of the stove. "Pour for the band," she said, and the girl obeyed, grateful to be sent somewhere easy. Auntie waited. The night took a long breath. Distantly, the judge laughed. Something in that sound, greased, comfortable, scraped along the inside of her skull. She dried her hands and checked the boy. He had done as she told him. Fire even, logs angled, draft held. He looked up for a word, any word. She gave him none. Words were cheap now. The dear things had already been spent. A hush fell, the soft kind that means sleeves brushing velvet, napkin set down, a room leaning forward together. A fork chimed on crystal. The groom stood, cheeks bright. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, and the room sighed in a practiced way. "To our mothers whose hands," he flushed, lost the sentence, found it again, and everyone loved him for it. The judge took another spoon of soup, shook his watch for the pleasure of it, and leaned back. Auntie's mouth was dry as lime dust. She reached for the dipper and stopped halfway. In the gap between reach and sip, a memory stepped through. A barn at night, lantern low, a man with soft hands counting bills while the overseer signed. "Strong back," the overseer said. "Good teeth." The man didn't look at her face. The band missed a beat. Someone coughed. A chair leg scraped so suddenly it was almost a tear in cloth. Auntie set the dipper down. She smoothed her apron again. She looked at the boy and let her eyes say what they needed to. Hold steady. If you want the full story, the truth of what was done in that house and why, hit subscribe now so you don't miss the next part. The night is just beginning, and the kitchen door is swinging. The fields never forgot. They held the prints of bare feet, the shadows of lashes, the echoes of hymns sung under breath when overseers passed. She was born among them, a child who never knew a sunrise that wasn't owned by another. Dawn meant labor, night meant prayers whispered into straw. Her name had been cut down to nothing in the ledgers, just a number beside, female, child. But her mother had whispered a true name into her ear as she nursed her in the dark. One she carried like a coal inside her chest, glowing even when all else seemed cold. By 10 years old, she knew the sting of rope and the weight of water buckets too heavy for her small frame. She learned to keep her voice low, her head lower, but her eyes always saw. She saw the mistress slap her mother across the face for a dish too salty. She saw her brother pulled from the quarters and sold downriver, the wagon wheels spitting mud as he cried her name until the road swallowed him. She saw the overseer's grin when his cane cracked across backs, the music of cruelty he seemed to savor. Every sight carved lines into her, shaping her not like clay but like stone, hard, silent, enduring. In the quarters, the air smelled of smoke and sweat. Nights stretched long, bodies folded on straw pallets, too weary to dream. But she remembered her grandmother's voice, brittle but steady, telling stories by the fire of a world beyond fences. One day the sky won't be theirs, the old woman said. One day it will open, and you'll walk free under it. She had believed it when she was little. By the time she was grown, the sky felt as chained as her wrists. The kitchen became her cage, then her kingdom. She was trained to stir pots, to chop onions until her eyes streamed, to knead dough until her arms ached. But in the kitchen she watched, and she learned. She learned what fed men, and what could fell them. She learned the power of salt and sugar, of heat and patience. And she learned there were things in the fields, in the woods, in the hidden corners of gardens, that the masters never touched. Bitter seeds. Strange leaves. Roots with secrets. Women whispered about them in the dark, passing knowledge as carefully as contraband. She listened, memorized, and hid those lessons in her bones. Her mother was taken by fever one summer, burning up in the corner of the quarters, no doctor summoned, no medicine given. She had held her hand as the sweat ran cold and the breath slowed, and she swore then that the world would feel the weight of such neglect. Her brother was gone. Her grandmother's fire dimmed until one night it simply went out. She stood over the graves they dug shallow with broken tools and made a promise. No more tears. Only memory, only resolve. The years rolled, heavy and merciless. She grew tall, shoulders straight despite the labor that bent others. Her eyes stayed sharp. The mistress mocked her for being too quiet, called her dull, and yet always demanded her cooking at every feast. Guests praised the dishes, never the hands that made them. This soup could win a war, one man had laughed once, wiping grease from his chin. She had bowed her head and said nothing, but in her mind she thought, it could end one too. The master beat another servant nearly to death one winter, drunk and angry at a missing silver spoon. She had seen blood soak into the floorboards, seen the man limp for months after, seen him sent to the fields half-healed to break in the sun. Rage sat in her chest like a second heartbeat, pounding every time she stirred a pot. Rage, and patience. She remembered her grandmother's stories, but she no longer waited for the sky to open. If freedom was to come, it would come with fire and with her own 2 hands. There were small acts at first. A pie slightly burned for the mistress who had cursed her mother. A dish with less sugar for a guest who had laughed too loud. Nothing that could be traced, nothing that could be punished. But inside, each act was a test, a rehearsal. She watched how much they ate, how greedy they were, how blind. She realized that those who believed themselves untouchable never looked down at the hands that served them. They never suspected. And that was their weakness. Years later, when word came that the daughter of the house would marry, the quarters buzzed with whispers. A wedding meant days of labor, weeks of preparation. A wedding meant money spent like water. And for her, a wedding meant a chance unlike any other. The largest feast in years. The whole house gathered, drunk on joy, unguarded. A night they would never expect death to sit at their table. She thought of her mother's cough, her brother's cries, her grandmother's hands. She thought of the whip, of the hunger, of the graves dug too shallow. And she thought of the kitchen, the mortar, the seeds hidden like prayers. The rage in her chest steadied into something colder, clearer. Not fury. Purpose. The night of the wedding would not be theirs alone. The orders began at sunrise. Lists were pinned to pantry doors, chalk marks on barrels, a flurry of feet across stone. The mistress walked through the kitchen like a general before battle, tapping her fan against her palm, firing commands. More sugar, more cream, polish the silver till you see your sins in it. Wagons arrived with crates of fruit and sacks of flour, with birds on ice and greens still damp from the river fog. The bride's veil, boxed like a relic, was set upon the sideboard for safekeeping, and no one dared breathe on it. She took her post without a word. The scullery girls scrubbed copper until their wrists shook. The butcher's boy dragged in a wooden table gouged from years of knives. The air filled with heat and steam, with the sweet iron scent of blood and the soft ghost of vanilla that clung to her dress long after she left the stove. She tied her head wrap tighter. She sharpened her knives on a whetstone until the sound became steady as rain. She set out the mortar and pestle, not where everyone could see, but not hidden either. A tool among tools. Inventory, the mistress called. The housekeeper rattled off numbers. The judge had sent wine. The parish sent flowers. The bride's cousins sent gossip. The master sent threats to any servant who broke so much as a sugar spoon. The men in livery joked in low voices, trying to be invisible and failing. The old cook from the neighboring plantation came to help, and spent the morning judging everything in reach. She greeted him with a nod and handed him a pot. He left at noon, defeated by her pace. She sent the boy for herbs from the kitchen garden, the honest kind, mint and thyme and a pinch of something bright. When he returned, his hands smelled of clean dirt. She brushed a leaf against her wrist, breathed in, and let her shoulders drop. Calm wasn't an accident, she made it, the way she made bread rise and gravy gloss. The night would have its own storm. The day needed quiet hands. By midday the ovens breathed like beasts. A line of pies cooled on the window ledge, their tops crackling softly as they settled. Dough rose in covered bowls, a slow tide. A pair of glass decanters caught sunlight and broke it into knives on the ceiling. In the pantry, she counted and recounted, bowls, platters, plates, touched each one, not for luck, but to claim it. She rewrote the serving order in her head, not trusting the list the butler had posted. He'd designed it to flatter the guests. She designed it to control the room. When the fishmonger came late, she didn't scold. She looked at the fish and knew the river had been stingy. She shifted the menu in her mind without moving her mouth. The mistress praised her good sense and pretended it had been her idea. The sous chef from the big house, really just a man with a clean apron and more pride than skill, tried to stir a sauce too hot and split it. She slid in, flicked her wrist, coaxed it back, and left him the credit so he'd stay out of her way. The bride's mother arrived, a cloud of perfume and nerves, and picked at everything. Not too spicy, she warned, as she always did, to someone who had fed her for 20 years. Not too plain, she added, which meant nothing and everything. The bride floated after her, light as a question. For a second the girl's eyes met the cook's across the heat. There was a flicker there, recognition, or an old childhood memory of sneaking a biscuit from a cooling rack. Then it was gone, replaced by a practiced smile that had cost money. In a quiet hour, when the house swallowed its own noise and the band rehearsed on the back veranda, she slipped to the storeroom. The door stuck as always, she nudged it with her hip. Dust rose. The high shelves kept their universe of things, jars labeled in a careless hand, bundles of dried leaves for tea, brown bottles with liquid the color of gold or old straw. She didn't reach for any of those. She crouched, moved a box with both palms, slid out a tin that had belonged to a woman before her. A life can be a lesson. A lesson can be a legacy. She tucked the tin beneath her apron and stood, slow and sure. Back at the stove, the day's rhythm dragged her like a current. She broke it at will. Stir, taste, adjust. Wipe the rim. Check the fire. Washington, start again. She marked pots with tiny signs only she would notice: a fold on a towel, a spoon turned handle out, a lid tipped a finger's width for steam. To everyone else this was the clatter of work. To her, it was a map. The butler poked his head in to announce the timeline he had devised while sipping wine and bullying footmen. "Soup at 7, he said, "roasts at 7:30, cake at 9. She said, "Yes, sir," and moved the clock inside her by 3 minutes in each place. 3 minutes was a lifetime in a dining room. It could turn a joke into a mistake, a boast into a cough, a swallow into a misstep. Control was not loud. It was precise. She called the boy to her side. "Listen," she said, and the word carried all of their history inside it. "The big pot, stir when I say. Not before." He nodded, eyes wide, seriousness older than his face. "The small ones?" he asked. "I will handle the small ones," she said. "Bring me water when I lift my hand. If anyone asks you anything, you did not hear." He nodded again, like a man taking an oath. The afternoon slid toward evening. Servants ferried chairs, set candles in mirrored trays, trimmed wicks. A florist arrived with armfuls of white blooms and scattered petals like coins across the steps. The bride kissed her father's cheek in the foyer while he adjusted his cufflinks and hid a stain of whiskey under his tongue. The judge's carriage pulled up late, and he made a show of apologizing to the master while making no apology at all. The guests strolled, they murmured, they judged, they posed. The house understood this ritual and offered itself to it. She grated citrus over sugar until the kitchen smelled like a summer field. She rubbed spice between her fingers, not too fine, not too rough, feeling when the scent lifted. She bathed the birds in butter and heat until their skin went the right color, the one the mistress liked to pretend was simple to achieve. She dropped dumplings into broth that sighed when they disappeared. She set aside 2 small tarts on a cooling rack near the far wall, not because they were special, but because she said so. She touched each with the back of her knuckle, a habit that looked like checking temperature and was, in fact, a decision. When the last light outside went thin and bronze, she opened the tin. Inside, wrapped in clean cloth, lay the thing that had waited with her through years of might and maybe. It had no smell to a happy nose. It offered nothing to a careless eye. It was not a powder in a storybook, not a drop from a fairy tale vial, not a plant a reckless child could find by a fence. It was a choice, ground down until it looked like dust. She measured it with the tool she trusted most: memory. Not a heap. Not a pinch. Enough. She closed the tin and set it beneath the shelf, far from children's hands, far from fools. The big pot steamed. The boy watched her face, not her hands. He knew the difference. She lifted the ladle, dipped, tasted, let salt steal back into balance. Then, deliberate, she did what she had prepared her whole life to do. She turned preparation into action. No flourish, no drama. The surface did not ripple in protest. The room did not change its light. Somewhere a laugh rose and fell. Somewhere the bride practiced her new name under her breath. The choice was made, and the day moved on. She did not touch every dish. She did not need to. Control is not excess. It is aim. She traced the path in her mind: who sat where, who reached for what, who copied whom. The judge would take soup first, he always did. The uncle with the stories would demand a second helping of whatever the judge praised. The master would eat with his eyes on the room, too proud to taste properly. The bride's mother would pick, scolding her own appetite. The band would drink coffee and be grateful and forgotten. She adjusted a garnish, shifted a bowl 2 inches, traded 2 ladles on a tray. Small moves, large echoes. The ovens exhaled. The clock in the hall chimed and forgot to stop. She wiped her hands and stood very still in the middle of the kitchen, as if listening to the house itself. The mistress swept in one last time to hover, to fret, to bless herself with other people's work. "Perfect," she said, as though she had made it so by saying it. "Do not fail me." The cook inclined her head and thought, "I will not fail what brought me here." At the doorway, the footmen waited with trays held like shields. She laid out the bowls in a neat parade, 1, 2, 3, each filled to the same line. She set 2 tarts on a separate plate and covered them with a napkin. She gave the boy a look like a hand on his shoulder. He set his jaw like a man. "Go," she said, and the kitchen breathed out with the bowls as they crossed into the bright. She turned to the next course as if nothing had shifted. Butter hissed. A spoon tapped the edge of a pan. She folded a cloth and placed it beside the stove exactly where she would need it later. A life is a long preparation for a short hour. She had arrived at hers and kept moving, unhurried, steady, certain, the way a river keeps going even when no one is there to watch. The ballroom glowed like a furnace of gold. Chandeliers spilled light onto polished parquet until the floor looked wet with fire. Every chair was filled, every voice eager to be heard, every toast delivered with a kind of confidence only wealth can buy. Lace skirts brushed polished boots, diamonds caught candle flames, and laughter rose in waves that threatened to drown the music. To the guests, it was a night of triumph, a seal pressed in wax on a family's legacy. To her, it was a stage she had been forced to build, brick by brick, year after year. Tonight it would burn. The bride, draped in silk white as bone, sat with her husband beneath a garland of magnolia. Her cheeks glowed with wine and attention. The groom's hand never left the hilt of his glass, his smile fixed as though carved there. Around them, cousins and uncles and judges filled plates high, reaching across one another with the entitlement of men who had never been told no. Their voices overlapped, deals spoken like jokes, names dropped like coins, laughter tossed like scraps. Every sound was sharp, careless, cruel in its joy. She moved among them unseen. A servant carrying soup is invisible, no matter how many times she is the one who feeds their hunger. She checked bowls, straightened platters, guided trays through the crush of guests with a hand as calm as water. She did not need to look into their faces to know them. She knew them by appetite, by the way their spoons scraped greedily, by the speed of their swallowing, by the careless clatter of their forks. They devoured as though the night itself belonged to them. The judge sat broad-shouldered at the head of the long table, soup before him. He slurped loudly, smacked his lips, declared it rich enough to make a poor man weep. The others laughed at his wit, though none found it funny. He lifted his watch, wound it once, and dunked his spoon again, oblivious to the weight carried in that bowl. She watched him from the doorway of the kitchen, hands folded in her apron. His satisfaction was proof. The plan had already begun. The boy kept to her side, refilling water glasses, clearing bones, carrying empty plates that still smelled of fat and wine. His face betrayed nothing. He did not meet her eyes, but he matched her movements as though he had studied them for years, which he had. No words passed between them, none were needed. Every tilt of her head was a command, every shift of her hand a signal. Together they wove through the noise like threads through cloth. The music swelled. Fiddles and flutes, the stomping of boots in time, skirts spinning, laughter spilling. Guests danced with flushed faces, their rings glinting under light, their voices raised to be heard over the band. They shouted their names, their triumphs, their indulgences. They drank and demanded more. Wine bottles emptied faster than servants could replace them. Silver trays clattered with cakes, quail, sugared fruit. No one noticed the way she guided certain dishes to certain mouths. No one noticed the way her eyes counted bites instead of plates. Only once did she pause. The bride caught her gaze as she reached for a slice of cake. For a heartbeat, recognition flickered, perhaps a memory of stolen biscuits in the kitchen when she was a child. Perhaps just the weight of being truly seen by someone she had never thought to look at. The bride smiled faintly, then turned back to her husband, to the cheers, to the clinking glass raised for her future. The cook lowered her eyes. She had no future to toast. The night thickened. Heat from bodies and candles pressed against the walls, thick as smoke. The air shimmered with perfume, roasted meat, spilled wine. Guests shouted over one another, voices cracking with excess. Their laughter rang too loud, their songs grew slurred, their movements sloppy with drink. The judge called for another toast, standing unsteady but certain of his power. He raised his bowl high, soup dripping onto the lace tablecloth. "To the family!" he roared, and the hall echoed with replies. The bride's mother dabbed her cheeks with a handkerchief, overwhelmed by her own display. The master raised his hand as if to quiet the room, but no one listened. The noise rolled on. She felt it then, a shift, subtle but sharp, like the air before a storm. The first sign. A cough swallowed too quickly, a guest's hand pressed too long to his stomach. A laugh cut short by a swallow that did not go down smooth. Nothing dramatic, not yet. Just the tiniest crack in the wall of noise, a seam no one but her noticed. She turned back to the kitchen, voice steady. "Clear the platters," she told the girl at the sink. "Slow. Don't rush." The girl nodded, not knowing why. The boy touched her sleeve. "Is it starting?" he whispered. She did not answer. She did not need to. The night had already chosen its path, and all that was left was to walk it to the end. It began with a sound no one noticed, a spoon set down too hard, a breath drawn too shallow. The judge frowned and rubbed his chest like he'd swallowed a stone. He took another sip to push it down. His eyes watered. He dabbed them with his napkin and laughed at himself for being soft. Across from him, the uncle who copied the judge in all things raised his own spoon and did the same. He swallowed, blinked 3 times, and reached for his wine. The wine missed his mouth by a finger's width and wet his collar. 2 seats down, the groom's cousin leaned back to laugh at a joke he'd already told twice. His laugh broke in the middle. He coughed. It was small, a hiccup in the noise of the hall, gone as soon as it came. He smacked his lips and reached for bread. His hand shook, then steadied. He told the punchline anyway. The table rewarded him by pretending it was funny. The cook stood in the kitchen doorway, hands clean, apron smooth, eyes calm. She watched the room the way a weather reader watches clouds. The boy hovered at her side, ready for any command that didn't come. She did not go forward. She waited for the room to come to her. The judge coughed again. This time people looked. He waved them off with a big gesture, throat working, face flushed under the lamplight. He tried to speak, found no air, and forced a swallow that made his shoulders jump. "Damn pepper," he muttered, and the table laughed a little too loudly out of habit. The uncle coughed too. His eyes ran. He tried to stand, his knee thumped the table, and spoons rattled. On the far side, the bride lifted her glass and kept it there, half a toast, half a shield. Her smile held. It faltered only when a bridesmaid set a hand to her upper belly and folded a little, as if she'd been nudged by something no one else could see. "You all right?" the bride whispered. The bridesmaid nodded, then pressed her lips tight and swallowed hard. A servant carrying a tray stopped mid-step. He didn't know why. Some old fear told him to be still. He stood in a wash of light and heat and perfume, and listened to the sound a room makes when it stumbles and tries to pretend it didn't. The judge's spoon hit the table. He pushed his chair back with a harsh squeal, knocked his bowl, and sent dark broth down the white cloth. The master rose at once. Habit, outrage, pride. "Careful, judge," he said with a dry laugh. "We've only got 1 tablecloth good enough for your watch." The judge leaned on his hands, as if the table had become the only honest thing in the room. His voice came out thin. "Hot in here," he said. "Hotter than a church roof." He laughed at his own words. It sounded wrong. The groom's cousin stood and didn't stop. His body kept going backward, stiff as a plank, until 2 men grabbed him under the arms and hauled him upright. He apologized to everyone and to no one. His apology turned into a cough that shook his whole chest. Spittle shone on his lips. He wiped it with the back of his hand and stared at the wet like it belonged to someone else. Now the noise changed. It wasn't louder. It was tighter. Chairs scraped. Napkins were set down. A woman giggled and hushed herself. Someone said the meat was underdone. Someone else said the soup was rich as sin. A man near the door swallowed and couldn't seem to remember how to stop. A young boy, too small for the room, put both fists against his ribs, eyes round and wet. The cook moved at last. She stepped into the flow of servants and guided them with small touches at the elbow. "Water," she said, and pitchers appeared. More coffee for the band, and cups were filled. Windows and latches lifted an inch to let in night air and the smell of wet ivy. "Clear that corner," and a stack of extra chairs slid away without a squeak. Nothing rushed. Everything shifted. The judge eased down slow. He tried to make a joke and failed. His cheeks had gone the color of raw clay. His tongue poked at his teeth. He reached for his watch and dropped it. It swung once on its chain and hit his hip. He stared at it like it had betrayed him. At the second table, the uncle of stories pressed his napkin to his lips, kept it there, and then lifted it to reveal a stain. His wife saw the stain and made a sound like a bird caught in a chimney. "You're fine," he said. He wasn't. His breath came thin and fast. His eyes turned glassy, then wild, then confused, as if the room had stepped 2 inches to the left. Someone called for the butler. Someone called for the mistress. Someone said, "Doctor," and got back the same word with a different voice. The band kept playing out of fear. Their fiddles shrank to a thin line of notes as people began to stand without knowing why they were standing. The first person to fall was a young man who thought too much wine was a joke. He put his hand on the table to steady himself and missed the wood by an inch. His chest hit the edge, his feet twisted under him, and he folded to the floor. A woman screamed. Not loud. The quiet kind that shakes itself apart and stops. The boy by the cook flinched and did not run. "Stay with me," she said, and he nodded, eyes locked to her shoulder like it was a post in a flood. "Open the doors," the master shouted. "They need air." Footmen rushed and fought with latches that had never been used. The night pushed in, heavy and wet. Candles guttered. The flame washed through long shadows across faces that had never seen themselves this way. A plate shattered. A chair tipped. The judge tried to push himself up and found his arms were slow, like they had been packed with wet sand. He looked around as if he expected to see a hand on his shoulder, and found none. He said the cook's name. Not her true one. The one the house gave her. He said it like a man who had never said please. She did not move toward him. At the cake table, a girl with a ribbon in her hair leaned over a plate and vomited so neatly it looked like prayer. Her mother yanked her upright by the arm and tried to apologize to those nearby, as if manners could mop a floor. The groom put a hand flat on the table and pressed, testing the world. He looked at his bride with a grown man's fear for the first time in his life. "It's nothing," he said, and then his throat worked once as if trying to swallow a snag. The bride's mouth went dry. She laced her fingers under the edge of the tablecloth, knuckles white. From the kitchen corridor, the old neighbor cook appeared, pulled by noise and pride. He took one look, sniffed once, and turned to blame the scullery for a dirty ladle. A servant brushed past him hard enough to spin him half around. No one listened to him. The hall turned into a fever. People moved in half circles, in stutters, as if the floor had become uneven. A man who had hunted men his whole life for sport gripped the back of a chair and tried to breathe like a boy learning to swim. A woman who never ate bread reached for a slice and missed and stood with her hand open on the air, frozen in a wanting she hadn't felt in 20 years. The judge said a prayer under his breath and then choked on the second line. An aunt tried to leave and found her legs slow and stupid. She clung to the arm of a stranger and called him by her brother's name. He shook her off as if her fear could stain him. Another woman went very quiet, pivoted, and sat on the floor in her silk as if she'd meant to do it. She pressed both palms to her belly and whispered, "Hush, hush," to the child inside her or to herself. A young footman, sweet-faced and new to the house, took a step backward and hit the wall. He slid down it without marking it and sat with his knees up, looking at his hands like they were not attached. The cook took one soft step toward him and then stopped. Two older servants lifted him, walked him out into the air, and sat him on the stone. He breathed. They left him to the night. Now the noise broke. Cries came sharp. A man yelled for water and got wine. Someone shouted for a pastor and got the names of 3 cousins instead. The master called for order and coughed halfway through the word. He tried again, and his voice came out thin and high. His face had the look of a man who sees the shape of his own life from above and does not like it. The judge reached for the bride's father, fingers clumsy, and pulled him close by the lapel. "Poison," he tried to say. The word came out like steam. People heard it anyway. Eyes swung toward the kitchen, toward the bowls, toward the hands that had fed them since they learned to chew. The room inhaled as one body, ready to point. The cook stepped forward into that breath. "Keep the doors open," she said to no one and everyone. "Set the sick by the air. Water, not wine. Cold cloths." Her voice was even. The commands were simple. They moved people who had been born to be moved. Servants obeyed her without thinking and found work for their fear. A woman knelt by her husband and patted his face, too fast to be helpful. A man clutched his stomach and swore at God and then at the floor and then at the cook he could not see. 2 boys helped an old man to his feet and led him toward the door. He thanked them, very polite, and then forgot what he was doing and sat down again in the middle of the walkway where everyone had to go around him. The judge's watch slid down its chain and swung, tapping his thigh in a calm little rhythm while his heart beat wild and wrong. He tried to say his name as if that might fix something, and it did nothing at all. The band stopped at last. Silence filled the spot where the music had been and made everything else sound louder. The scrape of a chair. The slap of a palm on wood. The single clear ring of a dropped fork. The wet choke of a man trying not to be afraid. The cook could hear each one. She filed them away like numbers. The boy tugged at her sleeve. "Mama," he said, a word he did not use in daylight. She placed her hand over his knuckles and pressed once, steadying him like a wall does a roof in wind. Then she lifted the hand away. He stayed steady. People began to say it out loud now. "Poison." They said it like it was a spell and saying it would show where to point. Heads turned to the kitchen door. To the doorway where she stood. To the woman whose hands had made their feasts and soothed their bellies and turned hunger into comfort for years while no one learned her true name. Eyes narrowed. Mouths opened. A trail of voices rose and fell like a rope being pulled by too many hands at once. Rough and sure, and going only one way at a time when the air had turned heavy enough to bend the light, and the room smelled of meat and spice and candle smoke, and the beginning of fear in a house that had never had to taste its own. The hall was no longer a place of celebration. It had become a cage filled with thrashing bodies and frightened voices. Chairs toppled, crystal shattered under shoes, and the air was thick with sweat and bile. People pressed toward the doors, clawing to get out, but the narrow frames could not swallow them all at once. Screams tangled with prayers, with curses, with ragged coughs that ended in silence. The chandeliers above swayed with the violence of the stampede, raining wax like tears onto the chaos below. The master bellowed for order, pounding the table with his fist, but no one listened. His voice cracked into a cough, and the cough betrayed him, seizing his chest and bending him double. The mistress shrieked at the servants, at anyone she could see, demanding wine, demanding air, demanding answers. Her hair had come loose, pins scattering like insects across the floor. She called for her daughter, the bride, who sat stiff as marble, white silk stained with spilled soup, eyes darting like a trapped animal. The groom, pale and sweating, clutched her hand as if it could anchor him, though his grip was weak. The judge was on his knees, his watch dangling from his pocket, mouth working but no words forming. 2 men hauled him by the arms, shouting for a doctor. "Poison!" one of them roared, and the word caught like fire. It raced around the room until everyone's mouth was full of it. Poison! 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 The music had stopped long ago, yet the echoes of the word filled the silence where fiddles once played. Dozens of eyes turned at once toward the kitchen door. Toward the woman who stood there, straight-backed, calm, her apron folded neat, her hands clean. The boy was half hidden behind her skirts, his eyes wide, but she did not move to shield him. She did not flinch beneath their gaze. The silence that followed was heavier than the noise had been. It pressed on her shoulders, but she bore it as she had borne every burden they had given her. The master pointed a trembling hand. "You! What have you done?" His voice cracked like old wood. He tried to take a step toward her and staggered. He leaned on the table for support, his knuckles white against the cloth. "Answer me, wench!" His spit flew across the floor as he shouted. No one moved to stop him, no one moved to help. The mistress joined him, her voice shrill, scraping at the rafters. "She cooked it. She served it. Look at her, standing there, watching us die." She clawed at her pearls as though they were choking her. "Confess. Confess, you devil's bitch." Her words tore at the air, desperate, unhinged, but they found purchase among the terrified crowd. Heads nodded. Fingers pointed. Murmurs became shouts. A cousin hurled a goblet in her direction. It struck the wall near her head and exploded in a burst of red wine. The boy flinched. She did not. She stepped forward, slow, measured, into the hall of chaos. Her footsteps were loud in the brief hush, a drumbeat under the screams. People backed away from her, as if she carried the plague itself. The master tried again, voice rasping. "Why? Tell me why?" He coughed, blood flecking his lips. His face was gray now, the sweat beading like dew before dawn. He reached for her with one hand, and his fingers trembled like a branch in the wind. She looked at him, at all of them, their fine clothes stained, their jewels dulled by fear, their pride stripped bare. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, low, yet it carried over the madness. "You fed on us," she said. "On our backs, on our bones, on our children's lives. Tonight you feast on your own deeds." Gasps followed her words, not from surprise but from outrage. The mistress screeched, lunging forward, hands outstretched like claws, but two guests pulled her back, afraid of touching the cook themselves. Someone shouted, "Hang her now." Another cried, "Chain her before she kills us all." The shouts overlapped, anger and terror tangled into one. The boy's hand found hers. She squeezed once, firm, and let go. He stayed behind, his face pale but resolute. She walked further into the room, into the eye of the storm, as if daring them to do more than shout. The judge, on the floor, raised a trembling finger toward her. His lips cracked around a single word. "Guilty." His voice was a whisper, but it carried like thunder. The hall was a ruin of its own grandeur. Silk torn, silver smeared with broth and bile, the music stands toppled on their sides. Groans rolled across the floor where men and women crouched, gasping, praying, cursing. The chandeliers flickered as if the air itself wanted to snuff out the light. Smoke from spilled candles mingled with the sour stench of sickness. Outside, night pressed against the windows, black and heavy, as though the world refused to witness what was happening inside. The master staggered toward her, his boots dragging across the floor. His hand groped for balance on the table, knocking plates and goblets to the ground. "You'll die for this," he rasped, but the power was gone from his voice. He collapsed against the chair meant for him, chest heaving, mouth open like a drowning man. The mistress clung to his side, half sobbing, half shrieking, her words broken into fragments. "Doctor! God! No! My child!" Her pearls broke from their string, scattering like teeth across the floor. The bride sat frozen, white dress sullied by wine and sweat, her veil damp against her cheek. She looked at the cook, really looked, and her lips parted as if to speak. But no words came. The groom clutched her arm with a hand gone limp, his eyes wild. He tried to rise, failed, and slid down beside her chair. His head lolled against the wood. She pulled away, her face pale, and stared at him with a horror that had no tears. The crowd swayed with rage. A cousin snatched a chair, as if to strike her down. A servant caught his wrist. Not to protect her, but to hold him back from worsening the chaos. Others shouted for rope, for chains, for fire. Feet stamped, voices broke, but none dared to step too close. Fear hung thicker than smoke, and her calm unnerved them more than the dying did. The judge raised himself on one elbow. His watch slipped from his pocket, chain swinging, tapping against the floor with each shudder of his body. His eyes, glazed but burning, fixed on her. "Confess," he croaked. "Before God." Blood streaked his chin. He fell back and did not move again. She stepped forward, shoulders square, voice even. "I confess," she said. The word was quiet, yet it spread through the hall like wind through dry grass. The shouts faltered, the stamping slowed. She looked at them all, the proud and the cruel, the greedy and the blind. "I confess that I fed you what you fed us, suffering. You swallowed it for years. Tonight, you taste it plain." The mistress wailed and tried to rise. Her body failed her. She slid to the floor beside her husband, clutching his hand as if their wealth could buy them one more hour. The bride bowed her head, veil falling like a shroud over her face. No one moved to comfort her. The boy pressed himself to the kitchen doorway, his eyes locked on his mother. She turned her head slightly, just enough to meet his gaze. In that look was everything she could give him: pride, sorrow, freedom. He understood. His jaw set. He did not cry. Two men advanced at last, ropes in hand, fury steadier than their legs. They circled her like hunters, careful, suspicious. She did not resist. She stood as if carved from stone, letting them bind her wrists. The rope bit her skin, but she did not flinch. When they pushed her to her knees, she knelt with the grace of prayer. The hall buzzed with curses and threats, but none drowned her silence. The master tried to speak once more, but the sound died in his throat. He collapsed backward, lifeless, his hand slipping from his wife's grasp. A hush fell heavy as earth. Eyes darted between the dead and the living, between the powerless and the bound. No one cheered. No one knew how. They dragged her toward the door, past the fallen, past the stained lace and shattered glass. Her footsteps left no trace on the floor. She did not beg. She did not plead. She carried herself like a woman already free. Outside, the air was cool and wide. The night sky stretched above, endless, untouchable. The boy followed at a distance until a hand held him back. He did not fight. He stood still, watching her vanish into the dark with the men who thought they had won. He knew better. Her name, the one the house never used, pulsed inside him like a secret flame. By dawn, the story had already spread. The slave cook who poisoned the feast, who brought the mighty to their knees on the night they thought themselves untouchable. The details twisted, the numbers changed, but her defiance remained. In the quarters, they whispered her name with reverence. In the fields, they murmured it under their breath. In the town, they spoke it with fear. A name carried on wind, sharper than chains, stronger than fire. She was gone, but she was not silenced. She had become a legend. And legends do not die.